The following was made as a television videotape. Its purpose is to provide orientation for those teaching the CHEM Study course.
Last week you saw a film on reaction kinetics, the rates of chemical reactions, and Professor Campbell talked to you about reaction kinetics. Today I'm going to discuss why we feel it's so important to discuss reaction kinetics in a high school chemistry course, and then we'll show you a film on catalysis. Now let me begin by recapping somewhat what you saw last week. You recall that we added to the characteristic energy diagram for a reaction not only the question of the relative energy of the starting products, which we might write A plus B, compared to the final products, C plus D. This is an energy diagram that shows whether it's going downhill energetically or uphill energetically. We added now, in order to discuss reaction kinetics, the possibility that there is some sort of an energy barrier between these two, so that it's not only necessary for A and B to get together to form products C and D, but also they have to go over an energy hill. Now you see that the energy difference here tells us that the overall reaction is exothermic. If the final products had been up here, then it would have been an endothermic reaction. But in either event, there can be an energy barrier between the two, whether it's exothermic or endothermic, and this energy barrier controls the rate of the reaction. And the temperature determines how fast A and B are able to go over the barrier. Now, I'm going to add to this discussion the question of why do we consider this to be so important. And I have a little demonstration here that I believe will convince you that this is an important matter, a bread and butter matter for a chemist to understand today. Let me first demonstrate a reaction of combustion, that which occurs when we light a match. This reaction of combustion can be contrasted to another reaction of combustion, that of a candle burning. And let me initiate a third reaction of combustion. Now you saw demonstrated here three reactions of combustion, and the difference between the three determines very much the utility to us of that particular reaction. And you see that in every case, the difference between the two reactions, the three reactions, that which determines the particular usefulness, is determined wholly by the rate of the reaction. In every case, the products are the same, mainly carbon dioxide and water. The combustion reaction goes very rapidly, if you wish, a pyrotechnic. This is a convenient source of light. On the other hand, here we have an opportunity to ignite any other reaction of combustion by the stored energy in the tip of the match. So in every case, you see, the control of the reaction rate is the important factor in determining the usefulness of this chemical reaction. Well, this is a characteristic, you see, of our understanding of reactions this day and age. We want to know not only what are the products, is heat released or absorbed, we also want to know what's the rate of the reaction so that we can control it by having it occur when we wish it at the rate we wish it. Now let me pursue this with three familiar reactions, and I'll begin with the one that is demonstrated in the text, the one you probably read about before you in preparation for seeing this television discussion today. That between hydrogen and iodine. And I'll be talking about a gas phase reaction. This reaction produces 2HI. Now I'll contrast that to some other reactions. For instance, the reaction by which HBr reacts with oxygen to give H2O plus bromine. This reaction, when balanced, involves 4 HBRs and 1 H2O and 2 bromines. And then finally, a third reaction that I wish to discuss that of the reaction between two iodine atoms in the gas phase to give I2. Now, I'll consider only gas phase reactions today, but you can see that these reactions bring up important matters in control of reaction kinetics. Let's consider first the H2 plus I2 reaction and ask, what are the factors that are important in determining the rate at which this reaction occurs? Now, I have here a couple of models of an iodine molecule and a hydrogen molecule. And it's very easy to conceive on this atomic level that in order for a reaction to occur between these two molecules, they must come into proximity. So it's very easily understood by the student that collisions are necessary for a reaction to occur. So that's the first factor that's important in determining reaction rate. We must have collisions. Now, it's also easy to understand that when these collisions occur, it will be necessary to break the bond in the iodine, to break the bond in the hydrogen molecule, to form two HI molecules. And it's not unreasonable that before the reaction of forming the new bonds occurs, that some energy will be required. So this provides this energy barrier that I mentioned. And that then is another factor that will determine the reaction rate. The importance of this factor will be determined by the relative energy of the collisions, and of course that's determined by the temperature. You can see that the higher the temperature, the easier it will be for the collision to provide the energy necessary to break the bonds to form the new ones. Now, there's a third factor, and that too is easily demonstrated, easily understood in terms of these molecular models. And that is that there will be some collisions that occur just at poor geometries. Others will occur at good geometry and facilitate reaction. And this then provides us with the third factor, the geometry of the collision. Now, those are the three factors. The energy barrier, of course, is demonstrated in this activation energy picture, and the highest energy state here we identify as the activated complex. That determines how much energy is necessary for A plus B, the starting materials, to form products C plus D. Now, let's contrast with these three factors in mind this second reaction, 4HBr reacting with one molecule of oxygen in the gas phase to produce 2H2O plus 2Br2. This reaction, again, we can expect will require collisions before we will have any products formed. So the factor of collisions is important. On the other hand, we see that 4 HBr molecules must get together with one oxygen molecule in order for products to form. That seems to be an extremely unlikely event, that we'll have 5 particles get together, 4 of them HBRs and 1 oxygen, in order to have the reaction proceed. And indeed, that process is a very slow one. It is very difficult for such a collision to occur with good geometry and have the reaction proceed. Consequently, a reaction like this would be expected to be very, very slow. In fact, it proceeds at a reasonable rate at moderate temperatures. And in fact, this is understood in terms of a sequence of reactions, none of which is as improbable as this 5-body collision. The reactions begin with one molecule of HBr reacting with one molecule of oxygen to form the molecule HOOBr, which is a peroxide, you see. Now, this species is formed rather slowly, but though by no means as slowly as would occur these 5-body collisions. It proceeds then in a sequence of reactions to decompose to the final products, the sequence of reactions all being very rapid. So the entire rate behavior is determined by this first 2-body collision step. If that step is completed, then the remaining reactions are all very rapid. So you see that what's important here is that the details of the sequence of reactions by which the products are formed become very important to us in understanding the reaction rate. The collisions that are important are two-body collisions. The five-body collisions are so improbable that a sequence of steps determines the reaction rate. Now, this is another factor, then, in understanding chemical reactions that we have to know about if we're going to discuss how fast a reaction occurs. This is called reaction mechanism. Understanding the sequence of steps by which a complicated reaction such as this one occurs is called understanding the reaction mechanism. Now, the third reaction that I wish to mention is that between two iodine atoms in the gas phase. Now, you understand an iodine atom has an unsatisfied bonding capability. Consequently, we'd expect this reaction to be extremely rapid, and indeed we would expect no activation energy to prevent this reaction. There should be no geometry problem. These ought to be spherical atoms, yet this reaction is very slow. And the reason has to do with the fact that as two iodine atoms come together, they form the more stable iodine molecule. The bond energy, however, is still contained in the molecule, and consequently, the atoms can merely fall apart again unless there is a third body that enters the collision to take away the energy. And this causes the reaction to require a three-body collision. So you see, three-body collisions are important in some reactions, and this is a particularly interesting case. M can be argon, or krypton, methyl iodide. A variety of molecules will satisfy this role of a third body which takes part in the collision to take away the bond energy that would be left in iodine and permit it to fall apart again if the iodine were not cooled off by the M. Now, this gives us an interesting opportunity to compare the effect of different M's. And one such choice is iodine itself. What about the possibility that I, too, acts as the third body? Well, it turns out that iodine is about 200 times as effective as methyl iodide to bring about this reaction. And the significance of this is that an intermediate is formed that is quite stable. And this material lasts for a considerable period, followed by a collision with a second iodine to give two I2s. Now, what it has done is provided an alternate path for the reaction. And this alternate path has an entirely different rate behavior than the one it was competing with. This provision of an alternate path without the consumption of one of the constituents represents the subject of catalysis. And inevitably, in catalysis, there is some intermediate which gives an alternate path but is not consumed.
This is a CHEM Study film, presented by the Chemical Education Material Study as part of its course in chemistry. In most chemical reactions, the reactants are consumed. A piece of sodium placed in water diminishes in size. Copper begins to disappear when placed in nitric acid. The poisonous fumes from this and other experiments are drawn away by a fan beneath the laboratory bench. When the sodium and copper are consumed, the reactions stop. Adding manganese dioxide to hydrogen peroxide produces another rapid reaction. But unlike copper or sodium, the manganese dioxide does not diminish in size. At least we cannot see any change. But let us check more closely to see if the solid is consumed in the reaction. We allow the manganese dioxide to dry, then establish its exact weight before repeating the reaction. Note the balance is adjusted to the weight of the sample. The solution of hydrogen peroxide by itself looks stable, but actually it is decomposing slowly. The products are water and oxygen gas. With manganese oxide in the solution as before, the reaction rate is again rapid. Oxygen gas is evolved as indicated by its effect on the glowing splint. Again, we allow the manganese oxide to dry before replacing it on the balance. The weight is unchanged, showing that the solid has not been consumed in the net reaction. Thus, the manganese oxide does not appear in the equation for the net reaction, which reads, hydrogen peroxide gives water and oxygen gas. The equation for the slower reaction without manganese oxide is the same. The net reactions are identical. The only effect of the manganese oxide is to speed up the reaction. There are many substances which increase the rate of chemical reactions without being consumed. Over 100 years ago, such substances puzzled Berzelius, the great Swedish chemist. He named materials that increased reaction rates without being consumed catalysts. But Berzelius could not explain why catalysts are not consumed. To him they had a new power, a hidden power quite different from the usual chemical reactivity. Even today we do not know how some catalysts, such as manganese oxide, really work. However, one well-understood example of catalysis is the decomposition of formic acid. The equation for the net reaction reads, formic acid gives water and carbon monoxide. At room temperature, decomposition occurs, but much too slowly to be seen. Addition of concentrated sulfuric acid leads to rapid decomposition, as shown by the generation of carbon monoxide gas. Experiments show that sulfuric acid is not consumed. It is acting as a catalyst. Other acids, such as phosphoric, also catalyze the decomposition. Each acid has its own rate. Phosphoric acid must, in fact, be heated to give an appreciable rate. But how do these catalyzing acids function without being consumed? To find the answer, let's begin with pure formic acid. These molecular models represent liquid formic acid. Each model is surrounded by many others, all colliding in a random fashion. Most collisions lead to little transfer of energy, and the molecules rebound without decomposing. Even with the catalyst sulfuric acid present, most of the collisions produce no reaction. To study an effective collision, we use a schematic representation of sulfuric acid and formic acid molecules. The formic acid consists of 1 carbon, 2 oxygen, and 2 hydrogen atoms. Sulfuric acid, the catalyst molecule, colliding with the proper geometry and sufficient energy, donates a proton to the formic acid molecule. By losing a proton, the sulfuric acid forms a hydrogen sulfate ion. The formic acid molecule, by accepting a proton, forms an intermediate molecule which will undergo further reaction. In the intermediate, this bond between the carbon atom and the oxygen atom is weaker than in formic acid. When collisions with its neighbors impart enough energy to the intermediate, the weakened carbon-oxygen bond splits. This gives a molecule of water and a second intermediate molecule, which can react with a hydrogen sulfate ion and donate a proton. This regenerates the sulfuric acid and releases carbon monoxide. So, in the first step of this reaction, the catalyst donates a proton to the formic acid molecule and is chemically consumed. In the final step, by accepting a proton, the catalyzing acid is regenerated. It is regeneration which explains a catalyst's unique characteristic of not being used up. Why are the rates of the catalyzed and uncatalyzed reactions so different? We know that the rate of reaction at a given temperature depends on the activation energy, which can be presented on a potential energy diagram. The curve represents the change of potential energy during a reaction between two particles. The high point of the curve shows the activation energy barrier to the reaction. We follow the progress of this typical reaction by a point on the curve. Changes in position as the particles approach each other are represented along the reaction coordinate. As the particles come closer, the potential energy increases. If the collision is sufficiently energetic, the activation energy barrier is crossed and the particles react. Notice the two particles at the top of the screen. Whenever colliding particles do not have enough energy to cross the barrier, they rebound without reacting. The barrier for the uncatalyzed decomposition of formic acid is high. The energy of collision between formic acid molecules is almost never enough to reach the top of the barrier. This is why in liquid formic acid, virtually no decomposition occurs. The high rate of the catalyzed reaction suggests a low activation energy. Here are the experimentally determined energy requirements in kilocalories per mole for sulfuric acid catalysis. The three sections of the curve indicate that the reaction occurs in 3 steps. The highest point on the potential energy curve determines the overall rate of reaction. Comparing the height of the barrier for the uncatalyzed reaction with that for the catalyzed reaction, we find a significant difference. The lower activation energy of the catalyzed reaction allows more reactions to occur in a given length of time. The catalyzed reaction rate is faster. The reaction of formic acid as catalyzed by sulfuric acid will be repeated to show the energy requirements for each step. The first barrier is encountered upon collision. If the collision has sufficient energy and the proper geometry, a proton is transferred to form the first intermediate and the barrier may be crossed. If the intermediate receives additional energy from collisions with its neighbors, it will pass over the middle barrier, breaking the oxygen-carbon bond and forming the second intermediate. The third curve represents the transfer of a proton back to a hydrogen sulfate ion. This regenerates the catalyst. When a catalyst is present, is the uncatalyzed reaction continued? Yes, at its own slow rate. Only a few molecules have enough energy to follow the uncatalyzed path. But the catalyst provides an additional and easier series of steps for the reaction to follow. A much higher proportion of the collisions lead to reaction, and the total reaction is much faster. Now let's study another reaction, the reaction between hydrogen gas from this cylinder and oxygen from the air. When hydrogen flows into air at ordinary temperature, the reaction is slow. Not enough water is formed to condense on this mirror. When hydrogen gas passes over the platinum gauze, the reaction between hydrogen and oxygen speeds up. Water vapor condenses. The hydrogen ignites due to the heat of reaction. We extinguish the flame before trying the other metals. The iron gauze has no visible catalytic effect on this reaction. Neither does a copper gauze. The platinum surface provides more favorable geometry and bonding properties than iron or copper. The platinum glows because of the heat of reaction. This molecular representation of hydrogen and oxygen gas shows that while the molecules collide, they seldom react to form water. Even when the platinum catalyst is present, most of the collisions do not lead to reaction. To examine a catalytic reaction that produces water, we use this schematic diagram of an oxygen molecule approaching the platinum surface. When an oxygen molecule strikes with favorable geometry, it adheres to the surface and separates into 2 atoms. Hydrogen molecules can now react with the adsorbed oxygen atoms to form water molecules, and the catalytic surface is regenerated. This potential energy diagram shows the two steps in the catalytic reaction. The first barrier is passed as the oxygen bond breaks and the atoms are adsorbed. Only about 1 in 1,000 collisions leads to adsorption. This is the slower step. The second step, in which hydrogen molecules react with the adsorbed oxygen, has a much lower barrier. Almost every collision forms a water molecule. This leads to regeneration of the platinum surface. Catalysis finds an unusual but practical use in crime detection when this police chemist is asked to test a piece of evidence for the presence of blood. The broken bottle is evidence from an actual murder case. If these specks are blood stains, they contain peroxidase, an effective organic catalyst for the reaction between acidified benzidine and hydrogen peroxide. The chemist prepares a solution to determine the nature of the stains. If the stain is blood, the peroxidase present in this speck will catalyze the reaction and produce a blue color. The absence of blue color in the solution is experimental evidence that the stain is not blood. The chemist selects another speck for testing. The rapid color change proves that the second speck contains the catalyst peroxidase. This representation shows that peroxidase has a complex structure. The largest part is a protein. Attached to the protein is a flat portion called a protoporphyrin. And in the center of the flat surface is a ferric ion. A hydrogen peroxide molecule wandering through the liquid combines with the ferric ion of the peroxidase to form an intermediate molecule. Then a benzidine molecule collides with the protruding hydrogen peroxide. One of the hydrogen atoms of the benzidine transfers to the intermediate molecule, forming two new molecules. One, which accounts for the blue color, is a benzidine minus a hydrogen atom. The other is a new intermediate, which now loses a water molecule. This leaves another intermediate, with an OH still attached to the ferric ion. This new intermediate reacts with another benzidine molecule to form another benzidine minus a hydrogen atom. A water molecule again detaches from the enzyme catalyst, which is now regenerated, ready to repeat the reaction. So catalysis helps the police chemist determine quickly whether the stains may be blood. The questions which puzzle Berzelius have now been partly answered. We know that catalysts work by introducing a new reaction path, usually with a low activation energy. And we know that at the start of a reaction, the catalyst is consumed. But finally, the catalyst is always regenerated. Modern chemists are still seeking a better understanding of catalysis. There are still many processes for which catalysts have not been found. Indeed, catalysis is one of the major areas of current research.